The day had been quiet, almost too quiet. Officer Mark Sullivan was wrapping up his patrol in Dayton, Ohio, when the silence of the station lobby was shattered. The doors swung open and a little boy stumbled in. His clothes were wrinkled, his sneakers untied, his cheeks wet with tears. His chest rose and fell so fast it looked like he might collapse right there on the floor. He didn't stop to think, didn't stop to breathe. He ran straight to the front desk and slammed his tiny hands against it. His voice cracked as he cried out, "Please help my mom!" The room froze. Phones kept ringing, papers kept rustling, but every head turned toward him. It wasn't just the words, it was the look in his eyes. Pure fear mixed with desperation, the kind of fear no child should ever carry. And here's where you come in. If you were sitting in that station, if you saw a child begging for help, would you take him seriously, or would you assume it was just a scared kid overreacting? Comment your answer below. Because Officer Sullivan had only seconds to decide, and what he chose in that moment changed everything, not only for the boy but for the entire community.
The air outside carried the bite of evening. Caleb's sneakers slapped the pavement as he charged ahead, tugging Officer Mark by the hand with a force that surprised him. For a boy so small, his determination felt unshakable. Mark let him set the pace. He could tell this wasn't just a child running home. This was a mission. The streets grew narrower as they turned corner after corner. Houses stood closer together here, some with porches sagging under the weight of old furniture, others with children's bikes tipped over in yards. A dog barked furiously from behind a chain-link fence, but Caleb didn't flinch. He kept running. Mark's heart pounded, not from the sprint, but from the unknown waiting ahead. Every step forward felt like stepping deeper into a story that might not end well. Here's the question for you. If a child pulled you through the streets this way, would you hesitate? Or would you run without asking more questions? Comment your honest answer. Caleb finally slowed at a crosswalk, his chest heaving. He looked up at Mark, his voice shaking. "Don't stop. We're almost there." Mark nodded, though part of him wished he knew what was coming. As they passed through the next block, Mark noticed details he couldn't ignore. A mailbox stuffed with unopened envelopes, a window taped with cardboard instead of glass, a car in one driveway with 2 flat tires, clearly abandoned. This was a neighborhood many had forgotten. Caleb darted around a corner, nearly colliding with an elderly man carrying groceries. The man's eyes followed them as they sped by, concern etched in his face but silence keeping him still. That silence weighed on Mark. People here weren't used to speaking up. Maybe they'd seen too much hardship. Maybe they'd learned to mind their own business. Caleb didn't look back. His focus was locked ahead, his urgency undeniable. Mark felt a chill, not from the wind, but from the sense that this wasn't just about one sick parent. Something larger pressed down on this block. Something heavy. And for those watching right now, do you think neighbors should step in when they notice trouble? Or is it better to stay out of other people's problems? Comment your honest answer. Caleb finally slowed at a crosswalk, his chest heaving. He looked up at Mark, his voice shaking. "Don't stop. We're almost there." Mark nodded, though part of him wished he knew what was coming. They crossed into a row of smaller houses, each one warned but lived in. Curtains shifted as Caleb and Mark hurried past. Faces appeared for a moment, then disappeared. A young mother on her porch pulled her toddler inside quickly, as if danger traveled with them. 2 teenage boys leaned against a fence, whispering as they watched Caleb drag an officer down the street. Mark noticed it all, but his eyes stayed on Caleb. There was no hesitation in his stride, no second guessing. He knew exactly where he was going. The closer they came, the heavier Mark's chest felt. This wasn't going to be a false alarm. The air carried a tension he couldn't explain. Here's something for you to consider. When you see something unusual in your neighborhood, do you act on it or do you look away like most people do? Comment yes or no. Because in this moment, Mark realized that too many people had looked away already. At last, Caleb stopped. He stood at the edge of a cracked driveway, pointing with a trembling hand. "There," he whispered. Mark's eyes followed. The house looked small, its siding chipped and faded. The yard was overgrown, grass swallowing the pathway. An old swing set leaned against the fence, one chain broken, the seat twisted. But it wasn't the house itself that set Mark on edge. It was the door. The front door stood slightly open, swaying in the breeze. No sound came from inside. "Stay behind me," Mark said softly. Caleb shook his head. "No, I need to see her." His voice cracked with desperation, but his stance was firm. Mark studied him for a moment, realizing this child wasn't just scared. He was prepared to walk into the unknown no matter what waited inside. And I want to ask you, if you saw a front door left like that, would you walk in or wait outside for help? Share your answer in the comments. Mark stepped forward, every sense alert. The hinges of the door groaned as he pushed it open wider. Caleb stood at his side, his small frame tense and his eyes locked on the darkness beyond. The living room was dim, light from the street spilling just far enough to reveal clutter on the floor, scattered magazines, and overturned glass, a blanket crumpled near the couch. Something about the air inside felt heavy, not just unclean, but still, almost suffocating. "Mom?" Caleb called, his voice cracking. No answer. Mark placed one hand on his radio ready to call it in, but his instinct screamed that stepping inside would reveal more than he was prepared for. He took one cautious step into the house, his boot pressing against the creaky wooden floor. Caleb followed close, his hand brushing against Mark's arm.
The house felt colder than the air outside. Mark's boots creaked against the floorboards as he stepped further in, Caleb clutching his arm like a lifeline. The smell hit him first. Stale, heavy, a mixture of damp clothes and something sour left too long. Light from the street stretched across the floor but couldn't reach the corners, leaving dark patches that seemed to swallow everything whole. Caleb's voice was barely above a whisper. "She was right here when I left." Mark scanned the room. A half-empty glass of water rested on the table, condensation dried into faint rings. An old blanket had slipped to the floor, its corner wet as if spilled from the glass. On the couch, a pillow was indented as though someone had been sitting there not long ago. But now, silence. Engagement question. If you were in Mark's place, would you search the house immediately, or would you call for backup first? Comment what you'd do. Mark motioned for Caleb to stay close. He knew the boy wouldn't wait outside. Fear had anchored him here. The deeper they went, the heavier the quiet pressed down. Mark noticed details that told a story. Bills scattered across the coffee table, some unopened, others stamped in red, past due. On the armchair lay a work uniform from the local grocery store, still smelling faintly of detergent, as if it had been washed in a rush. On the floor near the couch sat an envelope torn halfway open. Caleb's eyes flicked toward it, then quickly away as if he knew it meant something he wasn't ready to explain. Mark crouched down and picked it up. It was from Child Protective Services. He didn't open it, not yet, but the weight of it was enough to stir unease. She asked me to disappear. So I disappeared, with a plan she would never see coming. I woke the next morning with a strange clarity. The pain was still there, like a bruise that refused to fade, but beneath it pulsed something new: determination. Rebecca wanted me gone, then gone she would get. But not in a coffin, not with tears at a funeral. No, she would get my disappearance in a way that would haunt her far more than death. I reached for the phone and dialed a number I had saved months earlier but never dared to use. "Good morning, Silver Horizons Travel," answered a cheerful male voice. "This is Julietta Johnson," I said, my tone steady. "I saw your promotion about retirees living abroad, Switzerland. Can you send me the complete information?" There was a pause, then warmth in his reply. "Of course, Mrs. Johnson. Switzerland is very popular. My name is Klaus, and I'll be your advisor. Do you want details for short stays or permanent relocation?" I swallowed, surprising even myself with the firmness of my answer. Everything. I want everything. That afternoon, I knocked on my neighbor's door. Elvira opened it, her kind eyes widening. She was 68, retired, with a voice that always carried both warmth and mischief. "Julietta," she said, ushering me inside. "You look different. What happened?" I sat at her kitchen table, the words pouring out. The cake, the cruelty, the midnight call, the shoebox of receipts, the vow I had made. By the end, Elvira's hands covered her mouth. "My God, after all you've done for her? She said that?" "Yes," my voice cracked, but then I straightened, "and that's why I need your help." Her eyes narrowed with a spark of solidarity. "Tell me what you need." And so I told her my plan to vanish, to let Rebecca believe I had truly disappeared. The letter I would leave, the documents, the timing. Elvira would be the one to discover my empty apartment and deliver the truth. Her lips curved into a grin I hadn't seen in years. "You know I was a drama teacher for 30 decades, right? If you want a performance, you'll get an Oscar-worthy one." We both laughed, an unexpected, liberating laugh. "If you had a chance to fake your own disappearance just to teach someone a lesson, would you do it? Comment yes or no. Be honest, I'm curious." Back in my apartment, I opened my closet and pulled out 2 suitcases. I packed slowly, carefully. The blue dress I loved, a wool coat for European winters, my journals, my mother's old rosary. Every item I folded was like a line drawn between the old Julietta and the new. The shoeboxes of receipts stayed behind. They weren't just paper anymore. They were evidence, proof of love, proof of sacrifice. They would speak louder than I ever could. I sat at my desk and began writing the letter. 23 pages. My pen carved into the paper, each word chosen like a scalpel cutting through decades of silence. "Dear Rebecca, you asked me as a birthday gift to disappear from your life. I have decided to grant your wish. When you read this letter, I will already be far away, beginning a life I should have lived years ago. Enclosed, you will find documents proving the changes I have made. My will, now leaving everything to charity and a trust for your children. The cancellation of the joint account you once relied on. A notice that as your mortgage cosigner, I am exercising my rights. You wished me gone. Your life will indeed be easier without me, but it will also be much more expensive." I ended it with one line. "May you finally learn the value of what you've lost." She asked me to disappear, so I disappeared, with a plan she would never see coming. The cab pulled up right on time, 6 a.m. sharp.
Its headlights cut through the thin morning fog, a pale beam against the still sleeping street. The driver, a man with tired eyes and a baseball cap pulled low, stepped out and lifted my suitcases into the trunk. The sound of the trunk slamming shut echoed like a door closing on my old life. I slid into the back seat, the leather cold beneath me. The smell of coffee and faint cigarette smoke clung to the air. The driver glanced at me through the rear-view mirror. "Where to, ma'am?" My heart thumped, loud enough I was sure he could hear it. I tightened my grip on my handbag, which held the passport I hadn't used in years, the receipt from the bank, and my 23-page letter waiting back on the kitchen table. "To the airport," I said. He nodded, pulling the car into gear. "Early flight?" "Yes," I answered simply. I turned my gaze to the window as the cab rolled down the street. Each familiar landmark passed by like chapters of a book I was finally closing. The bakery, where I had bought Rebecca's cake. The park, where I had once pushed her on the swings. The hospital, where I had given 4 decades of my life as a nurse. Every corner whispered memories. Some sweet, some bitter, all of them heavy. I pressed my palm against the cool glass and thought, this is the last time I will see this city as the woman I used to be. The city slowly woke around us. A jogger crossed the street, bundled against the cold. A delivery truck rattled by. Streetlights flickered and clicked off as dawn claimed the sky. The driver cleared his throat. He asked casually, "Business or pleasure?" I almost laughed. How could I explain that this trip was neither business nor pleasure, but survival? That I was vanishing from the life my own daughter had condemned me in? "New beginning," I answered softly. The man gave a small nod, as if he understood more than his simple question asked. He didn't pry further. I leaned back, letting the hum of the engine and the rhythm of the road steady me. For the first time in decades, I wasn't rushing to Rebecca's aid. I wasn't headed to babysit or to write another check or to fix another crisis. I was headed toward myself. 40 minutes later, the airport came into view. Tall glass windows reflecting the pale gold of sunrise, planes already roaring into the sky. The driver parked at the departure curb. He stepped out, lifted my suitcases, and placed them gently beside me. "Safe travels, ma'am," he said. I handed him a tip, more than I normally would. "Thank you," I said sincerely. "You've helped me more than you know." He gave me a curious smile, but didn't ask questions. Some journeys he seemed to understand were too personal to explain. I gripped the handles of my suitcases. The automatic doors slid open, a gust of cold airport air rushing out to greet me. And as I stepped inside, ticket and passport ready, I whispered under my breath, "This is the first step of my disappearance." Some people leave with goodbyes, hugs, and promises to return. I left with silence, with 2 suitcases and a letter that would soon detonate my daughter's perfect little world. Because while I soared toward Switzerland, Rebecca would come home to an empty apartment, an open letter, and the crushing reality that her birthday wish had come true, just not in the way she wanted.
Long before the ambulance, long before Caleb's desperate sprint to the police station, Lydia was already fighting a battle most people never saw. She lived in a 2-bedroom rental on the edge of Dayton, juggling 2 jobs just to cover the basics. By day, she scrubbed motel rooms, her hands raw from bleach. By night, she stocked shelves at a supermarket, her feet aching from hours on concrete floors. Neighbors barely knew her. She kept her head down, paid what she could, and told herself she'd figure out the rest. The truth? She was drowning. Bills stacked up faster than she could pay them. Some nights, the lights flickered because the power company had already sent a warning. More than once, she skipped meals so Caleb could eat. She smiled through it all, convincing him everything was fine because what mother wants her child to see how close to breaking she really is? Engagement question. Should parents hide their pain to protect their kids,
Or should they be open about how hard life really is? Comment what you think. But Lydia's silence wasn't just pride, it was fear. And that fear would soon come knocking. Caleb's father had left years earlier. One morning, he packed a bag, muttered something about needing space, and walked out the door. No phone calls, no support, not even a birthday card. For Lydia, the betrayal cut deep. For Caleb, the absence cut deeper. Lydia worked harder after that, determined to fill the gap. But the truth was plain. She couldn't do it all. She was mother, father, provider, protector. Every dollar stretched thin, every hour borrowed from sleep. Caleb noticed, though she tried to hide it. He'd wait to find her sleeping at the table, her head resting on unpaid bills. He'd see her clutching her side after long shifts, too tired to complain. And yet, when anyone asked how she was, Lydia always forced the same answer. We're doing okay. Engagement question. Do you think walking away from family should ever be forgivable, or once you leave, is it unforgivable? Share your take in the comments. But Lydia's silence wasn't just pride, it was fear, and that fear would soon come knocking. It arrived quietly, tucked into the mailbox like any other envelope, but the bold black lettering gave it away. Child Protective Services. Lydia froze the moment she saw it. Her hands shook as she tore it open. The letter explained that someone had filed a report claiming she was neglecting Caleb. Neglect. The word pierced her like a blade. She had sacrificed everything for her son. How could anyone accuse her of failing him? Her chest tightened as her eyes scanned the fine print. They would be conducting a review, which could mean visits, questions, and the unthinkable possibility of losing Caleb. That night, she sat at the kitchen table staring at the letter until the words blurred. Caleb had asked what was wrong, and she had shoved it under a pile of bills. Nothing, sweetheart, just work stuff. But deep down, Lydia made a choice. If she got sick, if things got worse, she wouldn't ask for help, because help could mean losing the only person she had left. Engagement question. Do you think the system helps families in crisis, or does it sometimes make things harder? Tell me in the comments. And so the envelope sat unopened for weeks, a silent threat hiding in plain sight. The sickness started as a cough. She ignored it, pushing through her shifts. The motel needed her, the grocery store needed her, and Caleb, he needed everything she could give. But the cough grew worse. Fever followed. Still, Lydia showed up to work, sweating through her uniform, telling herself she couldn't afford a day off. She skipped doctor visits, skipped medicine. Every dollar she spent on herself felt like a dollar stolen from Caleb. At home, she grew weaker. Dishes piled in the sink. Laundry stayed unfolded. Caleb, too young to carry the weight, tried to help. He poured cereal for dinner, fetched blankets when she shivered, and whispered promises that he'd take care of her. But children can only carry so much. One night, her legs gave out. She collapsed on the bed, her breath shallow, her voice hoarse. Caleb begged her to let him call for help. She shook her head, whispering, "They'll take you away if they know." That night, fear outweighed love and nearly cost them everything. Engagement question. Would you risk asking for help if it meant losing your child, or would you keep silent like Lydia did? Comment your choice. By the time Caleb finally made his desperate decision to run to the police station, Lydia's body had already reached its limit. Her silence, her sacrifice, her stubborn fight to keep their world intact had pushed her past the edge. Mark didn't know all of this yet. He didn't know about the letter. He didn't know about the long nights of skipped meals and endless work. All he saw was a boy who had saved his mother, and a woman barely clinging to life. But soon he would find that envelope, and when he did, the truth about who reported Lydia would change everything. Because sometimes the real danger doesn't come from sickness. It comes from people who claim they're helping. Who do you think filed that report on Lydia? A neighbor? A coworker? Or someone closer than anyone expects? Drop your guess below. And before the next twist drops, because it's one you won't see coming.
The hospital room was quiet now. Machines beeped steadily, Lydia slept in a fragile peace, and Caleb sat curled in a chair beside her. Most officers would have closed the file there. Medical emergency resolved, case closed. But not Mark.
Something about this night gnawed at him. It wasn't just the unpaid bills scattered in the living room. It wasn't just the way Lydia begged Caleb not to call for help. It was the envelope. That envelope, stamped with the authority of Child Protective Services, had weight. Too much weight to ignore. Mark leaned against the cold hallway wall, arms crossed. His gut told him that Lydia's collapse was only part of the story, and if he didn't dig deeper, Caleb might pay the price. Engagement question. Do you think officers should dig into family matters like this, or should they stay out once the emergency is handled? Comment your thoughts. Mark knew one thing for certain. His shift wasn't over. Not until he found out who had put this family under a microscope. The next morning, Mark returned to the house. The neighborhood looked even rougher in daylight. Cracked sidewalks, mailboxes leaning at odd angles, houses that had long since stopped getting fresh paint. Inside, the smell of stale air still lingered. The living room was just as he had left it. Bills on the table, laundry half-folded, and the envelope lying there like a trap waiting to be sprung. He picked it up carefully, sliding a finger along the torn edge. Inside were forms and official language, allegations of neglect, a scheduled visit that Lydia had never attended, and warnings about possible removal of the child. He exhaled slowly. Neglect? Anyone who had seen Caleb run through those streets, who had watched him beg for his mother's life, knew there was no neglect here. Exhaustion, yes. Poverty, yes. But neglect? Not a chance. Engagement question. Do you think poverty should ever be mistaken for neglect? Share your view in the comments. But one detail stood out. A line stating that the complaint had been filed anonymously. Someone had made this call. Someone close enough to Lydia to know her struggles. And Mark intended to find out who. Mark knocked on doors. Some neighbors answered reluctantly, peeking through cracked doors or chain locks. Most said little, just that Lydia kept to herself, worked long hours, and rarely asked for help. But one older woman across the street offered more. "She's a good mom," the woman said, voice firm. "That boy's polite, always checking in on her. If anyone said she was neglecting him, they're lying." Another neighbor shrugged, muttering, "People don't last long in that house. Landlord doesn't care about fixing anything, just raising rent." That word stuck with Mark. As he walked back down the sidewalk, he noticed a shiny car parked neatly outside the next property. A man in his 50s stepped out, suit too sharp for the block, clipboard in hand. He glanced at Mark with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Morning, officer," he said smoothly. "Something I can help you with?" Mark studied him. The gut feeling was back. The man introduced himself as Mr. Harlow, owner of several properties in the neighborhood, including Lydia's house. He spoke with the polish of someone used to winning arguments. "She's always late on rent," he said casually, almost rehearsed. "I've had complaints about the boy being left alone, too. Probably best if Child Services steps in." Mark's jaw tightened. There it was. The anonymous report didn't feel so anonymous anymore. But Harlow kept talking, his tone dripping with indifference. "Honestly, officer, she's a liability. Houses like hers drag down property value. If she's out, I can make better use of that lot." The truth landed like a stone. This wasn't about Caleb's safety. This was about profit. Engagement question. What do you think? Should landlords have the power to report tenants for neglect? Or does that cross the line? Comment your answer. Mark walked away without responding, but his mind was racing. If Harlow could manipulate the system this easily, Lydia and Caleb's fight wasn't just about survival, it was about justice. Back at the hospital, Caleb sat at his mother's bedside, tracing circles on her blanket. Mark watched him for a moment before pulling a chair closer. "Caleb," he asked gently, "did your mom ever tell you why she was afraid to call for help?" The boy hesitated, then nodded. "She said someone wanted us gone. She said if they found out she was sick, they'd take me away." Mark's chest tightened. The puzzle pieces were snapping into place. The envelope, the landlord, the fear in Lydia's voice. But proving it? That would be harder. He looked at Caleb, at the boy who had already shown more courage than many adults. "Don't worry," Mark promised. "I'm not letting anyone take you away from her." The boy nodded, but his eyes still carried doubt. "And for you watching, do you think Mark can actually protect them against someone with money and power? Share your thoughts in the comments. Because the next step will push this story from a private struggle into a public fight. And not everyone will be on Lydia's side. If you believe families like this deserve a chance, if you want to see how Officer Mark fights back against a system stacked against them, subscribe now to Goodness Corner. The next twist changes everything.
News traveled fast. Within 24 hours, Caleb's run to the police station had become the talk of the block. First, it spread through the neighborhood, then the local church, and soon it reached the community center downtown. People who had once kept their curtains closed were suddenly talking. Some whispered about Lydia's collapse, others about Caleb's courage. For once, the story wasn't about hardship. It was about a boy who refused to give up on his mother. At the hospital, Caleb was still at her bedside, holding her hand. He didn't know yet that outside those walls, strangers were starting to care. By evening, the first act of kindness appeared. A grocery bag left by Lydia's door, a carton of milk, a loaf of bread, and a note scribbled on the back of an old envelope. "You're not alone." Engagement question. Do you believe one small act of kindness can inspire an entire community, or does it usually go unnoticed? Comment your view below. For Lydia and Caleb, those small gestures were about to grow into something far bigger. On Sunday morning, Pastor Green stood before his congregation in a small brick church 2 blocks from Lydia's home. He spoke about Caleb's courage, about a boy who ran through the streets begging strangers to save his mom. Young Caleb didn't wait for someone else to act. He showed us all what it means to fight for family. The congregation listened, stirred. Some shook their heads in shame for not seeing the struggle sooner. Others nodded with resolve. By the end of service, a collection had begun. Bags of food, used clothes, even cash flipped quietly into a basket. That afternoon, church members carried boxes to Lydia's porch. Fresh groceries, warm blankets, and a handwritten card from a little girl Caleb's age that read, "I hope your mom feels better soon. You're very brave." Caleb's eyes widened when he saw it. For the first time in days, he smiled. Engagement question. Do you shirks and faith groups be more active in helping struggling families, or is that the government's job? Share your take in the comments. For Lydia and Caleb, those small gestures were about to grow into something far bigger. By midweek, word had reached local businesses. The diner where Lydia sometimes worked part-time sent over hot meals. A hardware store donated supplies to fix the broken steps outside her house. Even the corner barber shop put out a jar labeled "Help Caleb's Family." For a family that had lived in the shadows, suddenly they were at the center of attention. But not everyone saw it positively. A few neighbors muttered that people only cared because the story had reached the news. Others said the help wouldn't last, that once the headlines faded, Lydia would be back where she started. Still, the sight of Caleb carrying bags of groceries inside his home, his little arms barely able to hold them, touched hearts across the city. Engagement question. Do you think people help out of genuine compassion or because it makes them feel good about themselves? Drop your answer below. For Caleb, the reason didn't matter. What mattered was that for the first time, their cupboards weren't empty. When Lydia finally woke strong enough to sit up in her hospital bed, she was told about the donations, the food, the repairs being made to her house. Tears filled her eyes. She was grateful, but also afraid. "They'll think I can't take care of him," she whispered to Mark. "What if this just proves the report was right?" Mark shook his head.
What it proves is that your boy is loved and that this city doesn't want to lose you. But Lydia couldn't shake the fear. To her, every act of charity was another spotlight shining on her weakness. She worried that Child Protective Services might see the attention as evidence that she had failed. Caleb didn't understand the fear. All he saw was kindness. He ran into her hospital room, clutching the card from the little girl at church. "See, Mom, people care about us." Her heart ached because while Caleb felt hope, Lydia felt the weight of what still hung over them: the landlord's report, the looming review, and the possibility of losing her son. Engagement question. Would you accept help proudly, or would you feel ashamed like Lydia? Be honest. Comment your answer. That night, as Caleb finally drifted into sleep beside his mom's bed, Mark sat quietly in the corner. He knew the donations were only the beginning. The real battle hadn't even started. Because while the community was stepping up, Mr. Harlow was stepping in. Mark had overheard him earlier in the hallway talking to a social worker. His words were slick, professional, and pointed. "Lydia's unfit. This outpouring of charity only proves she can't provide. You're going to have to make a hard call." Mark clenched his fists, rage simmering. The community might see Lydia's courage, but Harlow saw opportunity. And in his world, opportunity meant profit. Engagement question. Do you think the system listens more to people with money and power than to struggling families? Comment yes or no. The truth was clear. Community kindness had given Lydia and Caleb a lifeline, but if Harlow got his way, that lifeline could be cut at any moment. If you believe stories like this must be told, if you want to see how far one landlord will go and how far one officer will push back, subscribe now to Goodness Corner. The fight is only just beginning. Chapter 8. The Second Twist. Mr. Harlow wasn't the kind of man that blended in. He drove polished cars through streets full of rusted ones, wore expensive suits past houses with peeling paint, and spoke with the slick confidence of someone who had never worried about paying rent. When he walked into the hospital lobby, conversation stopped. He smiled politely at the receptionist, then spotted Mark sitting near Lydia's room. "Officer Sullivan," he said smoothly, "I hear you've taken a special interest in one of my tenants." Mark bristled. "She's more than just your tenant. She's a mother fighting for her life." Harlow's smile didn't falter. "Yes, but she's also a liability. My property suffers when renters neglect their responsibilities. It's in everyone's best interest if Child Protective Services steps in." The words were cold, calculated, and in that moment, Mark knew. Harlow hadn't filed the report out of concern. He had filed it as a weapon. Engagement question. Do you think landlords should ever have a say in how families raise their children? Comment your opinion. Later that day, Mark quietly pulled a few strings. With the help of a friend in the county office, he got access to CPS notes. The complaint was detailed, too detailed. It claimed Lydia left Caleb alone at night for days at a time. It alleged the home was dangerous and unfit. It even suggested Caleb was often seen begging neighbors for food. Every word was exaggerated, twisted, or outright false. Mark clenched his jaw as he read. He had seen the boy, clean, polite, well-fed by a mother who sacrificed her own meals to keep him strong. These weren't just lies. They were weapons designed to paint Lydia as unfit. And the signature line? Filed anonymously. But Mark didn't need a signature. The fingerprints of greed were all over it. Engagement question. Do you think false reports like this should carry serious punishment, or is it just part of the system? Share your answer below. For Mark, one thing was clear. Lydia and Caleb weren't fighting illness anymore. They were fighting a man with money, influence, and no shame. The following week, a social worker visited Lydia at the hospital. She smiled kindly, but carried a clipboard full of questions that dug deep. Do you have stable income? Have you ever left your son unattended? Are you physically capable of providing consistent care? Lydia answered carefully, her voice still weak. But Mark noticed her hands trembling. Every answer felt like walking a tightrope. One slip could tip the scales against her. Caleb watched in silence, his small fists clenched, his eyes darting between his mom and the stranger with the clipboard. Meanwhile, outside the room, Harlow lingered again. This time, Mark overheard him speaking into his phone. If CPS rules her unfit, she'll be out within a month. That property will sell fast. The confirmation hit like a hammer. This wasn't about Caleb. It wasn't even about Lydia. It was about profit.
Engagement question. Do you think people like Harlow care about families at all, or only about money? Comment with one word, family or money. One night, while Mark spoke quietly with the nurse in the hallway, Caleb wandered out of the room. He froze when he heard voices around the corner, Harlow's sharp tone cutting through the air. Yeah, she'll lose the kid and then she's out. That property is worth twice what she's paying. Easy win. Caleb's breath caught. He backed away quickly, his small chest heaving. He ran back into his mother's room, his face pale. Mom, he wants to take me away. He said it. Lydia pulled him close, tears burning her eyes. I won't let him, she promised, though her voice trembled with doubt. When Mark returned, he saw the fear in both their faces. Caleb told him everything. Mark's jaw tightened. Now it wasn't just suspicion, it was proof. Engagement question. If you were Caleb, overhearing those words, would you feel angry or terrified? Share how you'd react. For Caleb, it was both. And for Mark, it was the final push to prepare for a fight bigger than he'd expected. The community had rallied with donations, the church had lifted their spirits, strangers had stepped forward with kindness. But now the real battle loomed, because no amount of groceries or blankets could erase the landlord's lies on an official report, and no amount of goodwill could guarantee CPS would see through the manipulation. As Mark looked at Lydia and Caleb huddled in the hospital room, he knew the truth. The system wasn't designed for people like them. It was designed for people like Harlow, people with power, money, and the ability to twist rules for their own gain. Engagement question. Do you believe the system protects the vulnerable or the powerful? Comment your answer in one word, vulnerable or powerful. Mark made a silent vow. He wasn't just going to stand by and watch this family be torn apart, but to protect them.
The letter arrived 3 days later. This time, it wasn't hidden under a pile of bills. It was delivered straight to the hospital, handed to Lydia by a social worker.
The courtroom filled again the next morning, tension hanging heavier than before. Caleb sat between his mother and Officer Mark, clutching her hand so tightly his knuckles turned pale. The judge adjusted his glasses, flipping through the thick stock of notes. His face gave nothing away. For a moment, silence ruled the room, broken only by the faint hum of ceiling fans. Finally, he spoke. "I've reviewed all testimony, documents, and evidence. While concerns were raised, the overwhelming evidence shows a mother who sacrificed everything for her son. This court finds no grounds for removal. Child Protective Services will provide support, not separation. Case dismissed." The gavel struck. Lydia gasped, covering her mouth with trembling hands. Caleb leapt into her arms, his tears this time born from relief. Mark exhaled, a quiet smile breaking through. The truth had won, at least today. Engagement question. Do you agree with the judge's decision, or do you think CPS should have done more? Drop your answer below. But even as Lydia hugged her son, Mark caught sight of Harlow storming out of the courtroom. The fight wasn't over. It was simply shifting to a new battlefield. 2 weeks later, Lydia returned home with Caleb. But the house they entered wasn't the same one she had left. The broken steps had been repaired, the lawn trimmed, fresh paint brightened the walls. Inside, neighbors had stocked shelves with canned food, bags of rice, and fresh fruit. The church had donated blankets. Local businesses had pitched in to cover overdue bills. Caleb's eyes widened as he opened the fridge, full for the first time in months. "Mom, look," he whispered. Lydia's tears flowed freely. "We don't deserve this," she murmured. Mark, standing in the doorway, shook his head. "You do. You both do." For the first time in a long time, the house didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a home. Engagement question. Do you think communities should step in more often like this, or is this an exception? Comment yes or no. But even as Lydia hugged her son, Mark caught sight of Harlow storming out of the courtroom. The fight wasn't over. It was simply shifting to a new battlefield. Harlow wasn't finished. A week after Lydia returned home, he posted a formal eviction notice on her door. The reason? Property misuse and failure to maintain standards. It was legal jargon, but Mark knew the truth. Revenge. Lydia panicked, her hands shaking as she sewed the notice to Mark. "He's never going to stop," she whispered. Mark took the paper, jaw tight. "He might own this house, but he doesn't own this community." The next day, dozens of neighbors gathered outside Lydia's home. Signs read, "Hands off this family," and "Justice for Caleb." Local news cameras showed up, capturing the story that had already touched so many hearts. The pressure mounted. Within a week, city officials announced an investigation into Harlow's practices. His eviction attempt collapsed under the weight of public outrage. Engagement question. Do you think public protests are the only way to stop injustice, or should the system be enough? Share your take in the comments. For once, the powerful man had been forced to retreat. As weeks turned into months, Lydia's health improved. She took a steady job at the local library, less demanding, enough to pay the bills, and flexible enough to give her evenings back with Caleb. Caleb thrived. He laughed more, played outside again, and even joined a local baseball team. At his first game, Lydia sat in the stands, cheering until her voice cracked. Mark was there too, leaning against the fence, watching the boys sprint the bases with a smile wider than the outfield. Between innings, Caleb ran up to him, panting. "You came." "Wouldn't miss it," Mark replied. The boy grinned. "You're family now." Mark's throat tightened at the words. After everything, this wasn't just about saving a life. It was about rebuilding one. Engagement question. Do you believe family is defined by blood or by love and loyalty? Comment family or loyalty. For Caleb, the answer was simple. One evening, as the sun dipped low over Dayton, Lydia stood on her repaired porch watching Caleb play catch with neighborhood kids. Laughter filled the air, a sound that had been missing for too long. Mark joined her, leaning on the railing. "You did it," she said. She shook her head. "We did it. All of us." But as they watched Caleb throw the ball, Lydia grew quiet. "I still think about how close I came to losing him. How many families don't get this ending?" Mark nodded slowly. "That's why we keep fighting, for the ones who still need hope." And that's where the story ends. But the message is bigger than one boy or one mother. It's about the strength of communities, the courage of children, and the fight against systems that too often fail the vulnerable. Engagement question. Do you believe more stories like this should be told, or do you think people prefer to look away? Comment tell or ignore. And if the story moved you, if Caleb's bravery and Lydia's fight reminded you why compassion matters, subscribe now.